Good evening. I'm Patricia Vanskyke, Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Cincinnati Wine and Effervescent History. Tonight is a lot of firsts for us tonight. It's our first in-person program in 2 years, so that's a really big deal for us. It's also our first hybrid program, so we're sort of feeling our way through this. We knew how to do in-person programs, we knew how to do Zoom, and we're doing both. So we also have a Zoom audience here tonight that may be joining us with some questions. It's our first program on wine history, and as all of you that are here in person know, it's Cincinnati's first appearance in the Super Bowl in 33 years. So for those that may be from out of town, you may not be aware, but it is a really big deal here. So hooray! The Lloyd Library, as you know, has a focus on plants, and especially those of medicinal value. We have an extensive collection on the science and the cultivation of grapes. And Dan's program tonight is completely in sync with our motto, which is bringing science, art, and history to life. Wineries and vineyards in Cincinnati were once a center to our economic and cultural life. And we're going to hear more about that, a lot more about that tonight. After all, Cincinnati's first millionaire was Nicolas Longworth, who made his fortune from his vineyards. Some of those wines are making a comeback, and as well as wine bars. I would like to express my regret tonight that we are not serving wine with this program. This was our intent to do so, but so that participants could keep their mask on, and I'll be putting mine on as soon as I step away from the podium. We are not serving wine tonight. However, each of you will be getting, and this is our remote audience and folks here, will be getting a recipe in your email for Dan's Bengal cocktail that is made with Cincinnati wine, of course. It's really my pleasure to introduce Dann Woellert. He is a local author and food historian. If you want to know about that uniquely Cincinnati food geta, Cincinnati chili, candy, historic restaurants in Cincinnati, or wine, Dan is the place to go. His latest book, same title as tonight's lecture, Cincinnati Wine and Effervescent History, will be available after tonight's program for Dan to sign. Do ask that you hold your questions until the end of the program. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dan. Thanks.
Good evening, all my Zoomers. Now I'm going to share the screen and get my ugly face out of your screen. Okay, and we're up there. And perfect. Well, good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here to talk to you about something I'm very passionate about, and I'm glad, Patricia, you mentioned medicinal uses of wine, because I use it medicinally all the time. One of my passions, which is wine and history. I've been writing about weird regional and Cincinnati foods for about the last 10 years with Arcadia History Press. And I also, for the last 6 years, have been writing a blog that I call Dann Woellert, the Food Etymologist. And I thought when I started 6 years ago that I'd have maybe a year's worth of material about regional foods. And 6 years later, I barely scratched the surface. I'm finding new hyper micro regional foods and really good history all over the place in and around Cincinnati. And the whole Bengals fever has really put Cincinnati food on the national scene. If you've seen people chugging cans of Cincinnati chili and talking about all the weird food we have, it's kind of our time in the spotlight. So, and on that note, with Bengals fever, I wouldn't be a good Cincinnatian if I didn't talk about a Bengals Cincinnati wine inspired cocktail that I call the Cataboro Spritz, which is based on the Aperol Spritz. The Aperol Spritz usually has like a Brut or a Champagne or a Prosecco in it, and I'm replacing that with what I'm recommending, the 2015 Estate Miranda Nixon Sparkling Catawba Wine, which is actually a really good replacement for Prosecco in any drink. And then you mix that with Aperol and club soda, garnished with an orange slice, and you're in business. So that you will be getting this very simple recipe in your email tonight. So before I get started, I want to kind of clarify the difference between Native American grapes and European grapes. Native American grapes is really what is the basis for our Cincinnati or Greater Cincinnati wine history story. And those fall under the category of Vitis labrusca. So that includes our Catalba grape, our Concord grape, our Norton grape, Delaware grapes, and all the grapes that are native to North America. Then we have the European grapes, which most of us are probably more familiar with, the Merlots, the Cabernet Sauvignons, the grapes of, Central Europe, Germany, France, Switzerland, and Italy. And those fall under what's called the Vitis vinifera. Now, early on in our history, the first commercial wine producers tried to grow those Vitis vinifera grapes, but they realized very quickly that they just weren't built for our weird North American climate. So we start our wine history with Thomas Jefferson, American wine's first cheerleader. And Thomas Jefferson, he never considered himself a politician. With all the politics that he was involved in, he always put his occupation as farmer, gentleman farmer. And his vision of America was one that was agrarian. He didn't want an America of big cities. He wanted an America of big farms. And Monticello, has anyone been to Monticello? That was really his testing ground for all of the agricultural products that he thought would make America great. And one of those was wine. He wanted to grow grapes on his property. So in 1772, he intercepts this Italian immigrant who's going somewhere else, a guy by the name of Filippo Mazzei, and asks him to grow grapes and leases him some property that's adjacent to Monticello. He's not very successful because guess what? He tried those European grapes and they just weren't made for the weird Virginia microclimate. So then the revolution happens and Thomas Jefferson is pulled away and his agricultural activities kind of fall to the wayside. Then in 1787, when he's our minister to France, he takes a 3.5-month business trip through wine country, through France, Switzerland. He also goes to Italy and Germany. And that's where he really develops his love of fine wines. He visits some of the estates and crews, some of which are still in existence and producing phenomenal wines. And he brings that knowledge back to America. Jefferson had an extensive wine cellar at Monticello. If you go there, it's in the basement and it's strategically placed right underneath his dining room. In fact, he has a carboy system that's hidden behind the fireplace mantle where he could pull bottles up directly. And if you ate at Jefferson's Monticello, you would have at least 6 different wines, all from fabulous cru estates in Europe. So you'd be pretty inebriated by the end of a dinner at Jefferson's Monticello. Now, he thought of wine just like the new America, that anything was possible. And he thought, even though they'd be different, that we could produce in America as many different fine wines as they do in Europe. One of the chateaus that Jefferson stopped at was called Chateau Yakim, which makes a very special wine that's not widely known in the world even today, called Haute Sauterne, or hot sauternes, as we say here in Ohio. It's made from a grape that's allowed to rot, and that rot increases the sugars and the concentration of sugars in the wine. We in Ohio are the only state that makes a American Haute Sauterne. We make it with a mix of Catalba, Delaware, and Niagara grapes, which are all Native American, those Vitis labrusca grapes. Incidentally, about 5 years ago, a gentleman in Paris said that he had found in a wall in an old building in downtown Paris a bunch of bottles that had T or Thomas Jefferson or TJ engraved in them, and Christie sold each bottle for about $150,000 each. So someone paid a lot of money for Jefferson's wines. Incidentally, Cinder Stanton, who's the executive director of Monticello, doubts that Thomas Jefferson really ordered those wines or had anything to do with them, because he was one of the best accountants in the world, and there's no record in any of the farm books of this wine. So who knows? Someone paid a lot of money for some old wine is basically it. So where was the first commercial wine business in the young America? It happens to be in Vevey, Indiana, which is just about 2 hours down the Ohio River Valley in Indiana. And Thomas Jefferson had a lot to do with that. So a group of Swiss immigrants came and founded America's first commercial winery in Vevey, Indiana in about 1802. So that is part of what I call the passing of the torch of wine information from Cincinnati to what would become the California wine industry. So the Vevey, we'll talk a little bit more about the Vevey community and its founding. Nicolas Longworth hears about them, brings that information, and starts growing grapes in Cincinnati. He develops a network of other rich growers in Cincinnati, one of whom is Michael Work. We'll talk about him. He brings it to Lake Erie and basically saves the Catalba grape from extinction, and it's still being grown and made into wine on the Lake Erie Islands. A guy by the name of Masson, who was Longworth's sparkling wine director, moves after Longworth dies to Pleasant Valley Winery in New York State, and develops that industry. Martier, who was a tenant of Longworth, moves to Pennsylvania and starts the Erie, Pennsylvania wine industry. Nicolas Longworth pushes knowledge of the Norton Grape. It actually sends Norton grapes to a German immigrant wine community near St. Louis in Herman, Missouri. And then their leader, a guy by the name of George Hussman, takes that knowledge and is recruited out to a ranch in Napa Valley, California. So you can see, if it isn't for the Cincinnati wine industry, there wouldn't have been a California wine industry. So really all wine comes back to Cincinnati. So that's the lineage that we'll talk about. And there's so many great, interesting stories about Cincinnati winemakers that haven't been told. And you know, I apologize, I can't go into all of them tonight, but there's some really great stories that I found in the book. So coming back to the Vevey, Indiana colony, a guy by the name of John James Dufour from Switzerland, County Vaud, comes in about 1797 to America. He scouts places along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers and the East Coast to find the best place to start his wine colony. Basically, they had experienced a great deal of wars in Southwest Germany and Switzerland, and they really saw America as the land of opportunity. He had read during the Revolution that there was a lack of good wine supply in America, and he thought with his family's history of winemaking that he could build a better life for basically his family and friends, which he ended up doing. These are some of the artifacts from that original wine colony in Vevey, Indiana, at the Vevey Historical Museum. Originally, they did not bottle in glass. They bottled in salt crockware, like you see here. This is a grape gathering basket, a grape crusher. The women were known to make these big, broad-brimmed straw hats, and they actually sold them in Cincinnati. They were very popular in Cincinnati with the other vineyardists. This is a glass demijohn, and then one of the original grape knives that they used to cut the grapes off the vine. So in 1802, John James Dufour petitions to Thomas Jefferson for a 12-year loan on property in Vevey, Indiana, to start this wine colony. It's approved, they get the loan, and 17 members of Dufour's family and friends and neighbors from County Vaud in Switzerland come and start growing what's called the Cape grape. They experimented with a bunch of Swiss grapes and European grapes, but after 3 years, the only one that really produced anything was this Cape grape. So they started making a red, sort of burgundy wine that had mixed reviews, let's say. There were people that, it was sent to Thomas Jefferson. Actually, one of Dufour's sons went on horseback from Vevey, Indiana to Washington, D.C. to give Jefferson some samples of this wine. And of course, Jefferson, being our biggest cheerleader, said it was good. It was just like a Burgundy from Europe. Now, there are other contemporary accounts that don't give it quite as good of a review, but needless to say, it was the first commercial winemaking business in the country. So around 1816 to 1820, Longworth hears about this because part of the agreement for this loan was that Dufour had to write a book about growing grapes in North America. So in addition to getting cuttings of the Cape grape, Longworth also recruits some of the members of that original Swiss colony to come to Cincinnati. Hey, I can pay you pretty good if you work for me in my vineyards in Cincinnati. The three that we know that came to Cincinnati, the first one was this guy on the left here, John Martier, and he became a tenant for Longworth on his first vineyard in the west side of Cincinnati. Rosalia Bettens also came to Cincinnati and married into a wine family. And then a gentleman by the name of Frederick Disserens came from that original colony, and he operated his own small little vineyard and wine house, and then opened a very popular saloon and wine bar called the William Tell Restaurant and Exchange. And he operated that for about 2 decades in downtown Cincinnati. Now, Martier was interesting. He was one of Longworth's most successful tenants. And he worked for Longworth for many, many years until he saved enough money to buy his own vineyard, which he did. And that vineyard is now the site of the Dunham Recreation Facility on the west side. Many of you might have heard of the Dunham Tuberculosis Hospital, which was also on that site for many, many years. So that's a label that we just found this year that was one of his national premium Catawba wine labels. It happened to be on a crate from the house that his family lived in Pennsylvania that went to the Historical Society in Pennsylvania, where they moved to operate the winery. So history is never over. We're always finding cool things. And that's one of the very few early wine label images that we have from Cincinnati. So that was pretty cool. Rosalia Bettens comes to Cincinnati and she marries Henry Brockman, and they start a little wine community out on Beachmont Avenue between what's now McNicholas High School and the Athenaeum of Ohio. There's even a Brockman Lane that's still there. His house and vineyards and wine facilities are no longer in existence. But his son, William Brockman, operated a very popular liquor and wine business in downtown Cincinnati for many years. So, you know, Vevey starts in Vevey. Longworth recruits these experienced winemakers to come to Cincinnati, and we have wine industry. Although Nicolas Longworth did not like Cape wine. He thought it was like Madeira wine, kind of the really cheap $2 chuck at the time that was here in Cincinnati already. So he looks for another type of grape. And so now we move into what I call the Catalba craze that Longworth created here in Cincinnati. So Nicolas Longworth was originally from New Jersey. He was born of Tory parents who were on the wrong side of the revolution. So his father lost everything. And so all of his sons went outside of New Jersey to kind of escape their loyalist background and find their own fortunes. 2 of Nicholas's older brothers settle in the Carolinas and operate plantations, sugar plantations in the Carolinas. He works for one of those brothers for a couple of years as an accountant in the company store, where he sees native grapes growing wild in the Carolinas. and he also sees slavery, which he is not a fan of. So he comes to Cincinnati in around 1801, and he studies law with a pretty prominent lawyer here called Jacob Burnet. And he very smartly uses his money made from lawyering to buy as much property as he can in Cincinnati. And if you look at plat maps of Cincinnati in the 1840s through the Civil War, I mean, he owned property on the east side, the west side, northern Kentucky, out in the burbs. He owned a lot of Cincinnati. So he made a great deal of money from those rents, from those properties. And he's able to retire before he's 40 years old. I wish I was able to retire before 40. And he starts getting into winemaking. That's about the time that he finds out about the Swiss colony in Vevey and starts growing grapes on his first vineyard, which is in Boldface Creek on the west side of Cincinnati. It's now known as M. Schaff Woods at the Cincinnati Park. And you can still see, if you go deep into the trails on the south side, you can see the walls from the tiered levels of his vineyard. This is what one of his tenant farmers would have seen if they looked out as they're working on the vineyards. That's looking, that's looking southwest from the top of Boldface Creek in Delhi Township into the Ohio River Valley. And this is a painting from 1858 by an artist by the name of Henrik Lovey. So he looks for a better grape than the Cape grape that he started with, and he finds the Catalba grape from a guy in Washington, D.C., a vineyardist who's growing it right outside of Washington, D.C. Now, Adlam had gotten it from a place called Shoals Tavern, which was kind of a road stop between D.C. and Georgetown. It was where the Sons of Liberty met during the Revolution, had all this great history. So at the time that he found the Catalba grape, a woman by the name of Carolina Scholl, a widow, was growing it and making phenomenal wine, apparently, out of it and selling it to her customers. So he finds this grape, visits her, gets some cuttings, brings them back, and in 3 years, he feels like it's the most prolific grape that he's ever grown, and he starts writing about it. Nicolas Longworth finds out about it and brings it to Cincinnati. So around that time, after Longworth had been growing Catalba and making wines from it for a while, he tries to get all his rich buddies to grow them and start this industry, because like Jefferson, he believes that this is a really good industry for Cincinnati. He also thinks that wine is a temperance beverage. You know, at the time, most Americans were drinking rum and whiskey, which are pretty hard beverages, and that was considered sort of the opioid crisis of the antebellum years, you know, the whiskey issue and the temperance issue. So he gets all his rich buddies together and they form the Cincinnati Horticultural Society. And almost every one of these gentlemen here was a winemaker here in Cincinnati. See, this is Nicolas Longworth right there. This guy on the far left sitting down is Gabriel Sleeth, who was a gardener of Longworth, and many, many others in that photo. So they all started growing Catalba, and they all found that it was really prolific, and it is a very prolific grape. The problem is that if you let it go sort of unattended, it sort of makes the vines weak. So you really have to, there's a method to pruning it and making sure that it doesn't get too prolific, or it makes the vines weak, and future crops are a lot less than they are in the first couple of years. So most of the Catawba wine in the 1840s, let's say, was being drunk in the German saloons in downtown Cincinnati. It really wasn't anywhere else in the country. That was until Longworth learns about sparkling wine. And he learns that from a French immigrant who had a small vineyard in Westwood who was making sparkling wines. And he taught Longworth that there was a possibility to make these wines. Longworth experimented, and then he imported several winemakers from the Champagne region to help him sort of start this sparkling wine industry. And so then he became a guerrilla marketeer. After he realized how popular sparkling wines were, he shipped wines to the heads of Europe, one of whom was King Wilhelm I of Baden-Württemberg. There was another winemaker in Cincinnati in the Dent area by the name of Charles Riemelin. And he sent a bunch of his wine with Riemelin when he went to visit family in Germany. And he presented all this wine to the king on his birthday, and of course got, the testimonial that Longworth was looking for. The testimonial from the king of the most famous wine region in Germany, that's a pretty good testimonial. The other thing that he did was he commissioned probably what's the first product jingle of an American product, and that was the poem Catawba Wine by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And this is the poem that gives us the moniker, the Queen City of the West. So I think you guys need to hear this poem because it's just really fantastic. At the time, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, this is 1857, he was kind of the rock star of American literature. He had written Paul Revere's Ride and the Ode to Hiawatha, both of which were very popular poems at the time. So this is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Catawba Wine. This song of mine is a song of the vine to be sung by the glowing embers of wayside inns when the rain begins to darken the dreary Novembers. It is not a song of the Scuppernong, which is a wine grape, from warm Carolinian valleys, nor the Isabel and the Muscadel that bask in our garden alleys, nor the red Mustang whose clusters hang, or the waves of the Colorado, and the fiery flood of whose purple blood has a dash of Spanish bravado. For richest and best is the wine of the West that grows by the beautiful river, whose sweet perfume fills all the room with a benison on the giver. And his hollow trees are the haunts of bees forever going and coming. So this crystal hive is all alive with a swarming and buzzing and humming. Very good in its way is the Verzenay, or the silvery, soft and creamy, but Catawba wine has a taste more divine, more dulcet, delicious and dreamy. There grows no vine by the haunted Rhine, by Danube or Guadalquivir, nor on island or cape that bears such a grape as grows by the beautiful river. Drugged in their juice for foreign use, when shipped o'er the reeling Atlantic, to rack our brains with fever pains that have driven the old world frantic. To the sewers and sinks with all such drinks, after them tumble the mixer, for poison malign is such Borgia wine, or at best but a devil's elixir. While pure as a spring is the wine that I sing, and to praise it one needs but name it, for Catawba wine has need of no sign, no tavern bush to proclaim it. And this song of the vine, this greeting of mine, the winds and the birds shall deliver to the Queen of the West in her garlands dressed on the banks of the beautiful Ohio River. So I think by now someone should have set that to music, don't you think? As a product jingle, maybe Jake Speed and the Freddies would put that to music. That would be pretty cool, I think. So Longworth, guerrilla marketeer. Now we're on the international scene. We're known for Cincinnati sparkling Catawba wine. This is a lithograph, kind of a glorified lithograph that's supposed to represent one of his vineyards on the east side. And one of the things that is true about it is that women worked alongside the men, and in many cases worked harder in the vineyards than the men. And there's several references that Nicolas Longworth talks about women working. He was surprised to see women working in the vineyards that are in the horticultural journals at the time. And so he goes through Germany and puts ads in the newspapers in the winemaking regions of Baden-Württemberg, so the southwest corner of Germany. And he brings a lot of immigrants and sets them up in Cincinnati first as tenant farmers for him in his vineyards, and then they make money and they move on to other things. But the irony is that his best vineyardist is not from that winemaking region at all, but is from the very northwest of Germany, a man by the name of Christian Schnieke. And although we have no photo of him, I think he is supposed to be represented in the lower corner of the portrait of Longworth that hangs at the Taft Museum that was by Duncanson. If you look in the lower left-hand corner where I've put the red circle, there's an image of a vineyardist with one of those broad-brimmed straw hats that's walking away. And there's all these references in the horticultural journals and in travel journals of people that visited the Longworth family to see their vineyards that talk about Christian Schnieke walking down to his house and bringing them up to his vineyard, which was at the top of Eden Park. And so I think that's meant to be our image of Christian Schnieke, which is kind of cool. So Longworth passes away in 1863, and he really didn't move. He experimented and grew hundreds of different types of grapes, but he was so spoiled by that initial productivity of the Catalba grape that he really didn't branch out much. He didn't really grow anything besides the Catalba and the Isabella. But at his death in 1863, he has a total of 122 acres of vineyards, over 27 or so tenant workers, and they were in 3 clusters. His first big vineyards were in Boldface Creek in Delhi, which is now Emshoff Woods, the Garden of Eden, which is now Eden Park in the Art Museum, and Bald Hill, which is now Columbia Tusculum by Alms Park in that area of Mount Lookout. He had 2 wine houses and owned interest in a third with the Zimmerman brothers in downtown. And there's evidence that he had a small 4th press in his Bald Hill vineyards. So one of his wine houses was sold to a pharmaceutical company. And then his grandson, this gentleman here, William Pope Anderson, takes over for the next 5 years and tries to operate the wine house and diversifies a little bit outside of the Catalba grape. But the cool thing, because none of the original Longworth Winehouse buildings are standing today, is that he created this great product brochure in 1864 that has lithographs that detail the operations and show what it looked like. So that's pretty cool. One of them is here that shows the aging room for the sparkling wines, the bottling, corking, and wiring department, which was probably a jolly place to work. One of his great presses. And so they operated for about another 5 years and then sold to a cottonseed oil company, and the Longworth Winehouse was not to be anymore. So Longworth was kind of a blessing and a curse in the same sense. A blessing that he put all this money into the guerrilla marketing and really put us on the map. But he also created this industry that was dependent on his wine house and had all these small growers that didn't have their own presses and couldn't produce, and in many cases didn't know how to produce their own wines. So when he passes away and the wine house is sold, there's this whole industry of smaller grape growers that are like, well, we really aren't going to make them by ourselves, and there's no one else we can sell our grapes to. So they went into other products. This is an interesting photo. This was from the Cincinnati Enquirer in the 1920s. That pharmaceutical company had forgotten that their cell beneath their building were the original Longworth wine cellars, and someone busted through, kind of like we've done recently with the beer tunnels and over the Rhine, and they found a bunch of Longworth wine bottles and found out that this was the Longworth Wine House. So this is the only known photographic image of one of Longworth's wine cellars. So that's pretty cool. And this is the one bottle that the Cincinnati Museum Center owns of Longworth's entire wine operation from 1840 to 1870, basically. And this was only received about 5 years ago. So what that means is, hardly any of them made it, or some collectors have, a mother load of Longworth wine bottles, and hopefully that's the case, that they don't know about yet. This is a kid who came upon the original walls of Longworth's West Side vineyards in Emshoff Woods. So Longworth's son was not interested in winemaking. His grandson had a small interest, but he was more of a serial CEO. He wasn't really a wine expert. But his son-in-law, William J. Flagg, who was married to his daughter Eliza, actually built a winemaking operation in Buena Vista, Ohio, near Portsmouth. And that wine press and wine house is still standing today. He had over 80 acres of vineyards in that Buena Vista area and made wines. And when Nicolas Longworth dies and his wife gets her inheritance, they go on a 3-year vacation to wine country and travel all the major vineyards and wine regions of Central Europe. And he writes a book called 3 Seasons in European Vineyards, which is pretty interesting. And he talks a lot about Longworth's operations and the type of grapes that Longworth grew. But it's interesting that he's the only family member really that took an interest in the wine industry. So again, there was no one to really pass the buck to from in his own family. And aside from Longworth, there were many what I would consider wine barons, industrialists who made their money in other industries and then took up winemaking when they saw that Longworth was successful. Peter and George Bogan had a very large and prolific winery and winemaking business in Carthage that's now the Evergreen Retirement Community in the Williamsburg Apartments. Michael Work, who Work Road in Westwood is named after, had a large operation, and we'll talk about him. That surly looking guy, Thomas Yateman, had a pretty big operation in Riverside, and he was part of the Cincinnati Horticultural Society, and very early on won a lot of awards. And he liked to host meetings at his house, I'm sure, to show off his trophy cabinet. The guy on the end is Sebastian Fay, who had a pretty long-running wine business in Brighton, so kind of in the city center. So in 1863, around the time that Longworth dies, we kind of got, 3 strikes against us. The biggest wine producer dies, and then we had this infestation. We didn't know at the time that they were bugs, but it was called the black rot, of this little mite called phylloxera. And if you didn't have your vineyards kind of planted in a very aerated area, because of our weird, wet springs, if those vine roots got wet, these mites could bite into what's normally a pretty strong husk that they can't get into. And in 1863 and 1864, there were those wet springs, and a lot of the Catawba wines in particular, Catawba vineyards, were decimated by these bugs. Then our surly guy, Thomas Yateman, he had probably one of the oldest Catawba vineyards in Cincinnati, and he had really sort of let it go. He wasn't pruning it. He wasn't, he wasn't replanting new plants. So his vineyard was very susceptible to the bad weather seasons of 1863 and 1864. In 1864, he basically loses his entire 6-acre vineyard on the river, and he is mad. He was a member of the Cincinnati Horticultural Society. He comes in with a treatise in hand at one of their meetings and basically reads and says, Cincinnati is not a wine growing region. If you're in the, if you continue to grow wine and the Catalba grape, you're crazy. You're going to lose your, your life fortune. And then basically mic drops and walks out. That treatise was republished in all the horticultural journals at the time in America. So, everybody's like, oh, okay, well, Cincinnati is no longer a winemaking region. So the Cincinnati Horticultural Society, many of whom were still, invested heavily in the business, were like, well, God, we got to put a committee together and put out a study that shows that, yeah, Cincinnati is still a winemaking region. And so they did. And there were other grapes besides the Catalba that were being grown by other winemakers, not Longworth in particular, because he really never thought that any grape stood up to the Catalba, either in in growing productivity or in the quality of wine that it made. But there were 4 particular grapes that did very well in Cincinnati. The Norton Grape, which came out of Virginia, which is still being grown in Southwest Ohio. The Delaware Grape, which came out of not Delaware on the Northeast coast, but Delaware, Ohio. The Ives Grape, which is the only grape that was proliferated here in Cincinnati. It's not being grown in Cincinnati anymore, but it is being grown in Ohio. And then finally, the Concord grape, which we all know is kind of the grape juice, grape jelly grape of North America. So they put out this report, the Cincinnati Horticultural Society, kind of refuting this mic drop of Thomas Yateman, and said, yeah, the Catalba may not be the perfect grape for our region and our weather, but there are other grapes, and they make fabulous wines, by the way. And so the Cincinnati wine industry went on in through the 1870s and 1880s, kind of fueled by these other grapes that were found to be more prolific or more resistant to our wonky weather here in Ohio. And so most of those small Germanic winemakers that depended on Nicolas Longworth were on the west side. This is a map of Delhi Township and Riverside and basically the west side of Cincinnati. The majority of this land at the time of this map was being grown with grapes. The west side, those of you that have been over there know that it's a very hilly terrain, and wine or grapes lends itself to being grown in that type of environment. The majority of these growers, though, converted to other agricultural products. But some of the prominent West Side winemakers are those that were responsible for all this knowledge created in Cincinnati. Charles Schumann was a pretty prolific grower in Riverside. He wrote the very first of our books, called The Vine Dresser's Manual, in 1845. Robert Buchanan of Clifton wrote 3 editions of The Culture of the Grape. Charles Riemelin, who was the guy that Longworth had sent the original sparkling wine over to the King of Bavaria, he wrote The Vine Dresser's Manual and The Winemaker's Manual in 1867. He lived in Dent. And then finally, John Aston Warder, he wrote and edited The Vineyard Culture Improved and Cheapened in 1867. What's interesting about Warder, he originally lived in Clifton, and his property would become the Scarlet Oaks facility that's there on, what is that street? Lafayette, thank you, yeah. And he moved from Clifton and built a really nice house in North Bend that's still in existence. So all this knowledge that we created here in Cincinnati, growing our native wines, passed along to the other regions as our winemakers moved throughout the country. One of the Catholic parishes over on the west side, Our Lady of Victory, the founding members, pretty much all of them were winemakers. In fact, the land that the original church was built on was donated by John Gertison, who was one of the first winemakers. John Behrman, Sebastian Rentz, Protus Heckinger, Stefan Tuchfarber, Ignaz Wittstetter, and Theodor Lips, all very German-sounding names, and all immigrants from the winemaking region of Germany. So what kind of products did they make when they stopped growing wine on the west side? Well, a lot of these German growers formed what was called the Deutsch Gärtner Untersexensverein, which is German for the German Gardeners Beneficial Society. So before there were insurance companies, groups of like-minded people would get together and they would put in a monthly payment and basically create insurance companies. So you put in money every month. If you were injured on the job or you needed to pay for a funeral, you would take that money out. So it was our very first concepts of insurance companies. And so all those former grape growers on the west side that sold their grapes to the Longworth Wine House moved to other products and became what were called gardeners. So basically, produce growers that serve the markets of downtown Cincinnati. One of those was the Witterstetter family, but instead of going to produce, they went into flowers. And Ignace Witterstetter, who was the immigrant of the family, his grandson became known as the Carnation King of the U.S. because he created this very specific pink carnation, and they were the first in Cincinnati to grow flowers in greenhouses. But they still kept their winemaking legacy. They have a wine crusher in one of their small presses in their greenhouses, and they still make wine that they place in competitions locally, still even a couple of years ago. Their farmstead is now the House Museum of the Delhi Historical Society. So remember that Michael Work that we talked about from Westwood? He was really the savior of the Catalba grape that was grown in Cincinnati, and we'll talk about him. So he was an immigrant from Alsace-Lorraine, or Alsace at the time, and he actually made his money in soap and glycerin. We were a pork producing town, so there was a lot of pig fat and tallow that could be made into soap and distilled into glycerin. So that's how he made his money. He starts growing grapes around 1847 on the west side of town, starts getting all sorts of awards for his winemaking in 1852 and 1853. He wins the Silver Cup Awards, which was a yearly award given by the Cincinnati Horticultural Society for the best wines. This is a map of Westwood, and you can see that first red arrow at the top, that's Michael Work's property. Next to him is a gentleman named Valentine Miller. He was a French immigrant who taught Work, as well as Nicolas Longworth, how to make sparkling wines. The third arrow is the property of George Fine, who operated a vineyard and had a wine house that was very popular with folks, German immigrants from downtown Cincinnati. And then in the far left corner is the vineyard of Gilbert Dater. And he was an immigrant from Bavaria, but what's interesting about his property is that during Prohibition, it became the Death Valley headquarters of George Remus, who is the bourbon guy. So lots of history in Westwood with winemaking. This is a lithograph of Michael Work's house on the left and his extensive winemaking facilities in the back. So in 1871, after they had seen a lot of devastating bad weather seasons for the Catalba grape in Cincinnati, Work decides to partner with a guy by the name of Andrew Worrell, who was an early pioneer winemaker in the Lake Erie Islands. And they open up a winery in Middle Bass Island called Work and Worrell. They build that fabulous clubhouse there that had a dance hall and bowling alleys and a great view of Lake Erie. And in 1875, it was listed as the largest winery in the United States. Work and Worrell partnered for about a decade, and then they sold their interest, and Worrell continued on as the Golden Eagle Wineries. It was then sold to Lon's Winery, and now the site of that original building and clubhouse is Middle Bass Park, which is a park on Middle Bass Island. And unfortunately, I contacted them in their historical society, and they have no bottles or labels or anything related to the Work and Worrell winery, which is unfortunate. Somewhere out there, there's a Work wine bottle, I'm hoping. So this shows that Work was actually the king of sparkling wine in Cincinnati, not Nicolas Longworth. Longworth only made Catalba and Isabella sparkling wines, but Work made sparkling wines from the Norton Grape, the Diana Grape, the Delaware, and even the Ives Grape. And they were rated 100% in 1877 by the Wine Growers Association. Luckily, Nicolas Longworth wasn't alive to see it, but at the Paris Wine Exposition of 1867, the Longworth Golden Anniversary Sparkling Catawba Wine was submitted alongside the Work Sparkling Catawba Wine. And guess who won the highest score? It was Works. So Work apparently made some pretty phenomenal wines and was more prolific in the types of grapes that he used. So we can't talk about Work without talking about the fabulous homes that his children built with his money after he passed away. In 1893, when he passed away and they inherited their money, he had 5 children that were living, and they wasted no time in building these, opulent Gilded Age mansions. Elsa, the one on the left, was built by Casimir Work, his son. That's still standing and owned by a couple that's preserving it. Willadell, which was the home of his daughter Adele Work Oskamp, is now a retirement community, still standing. Work Castle was probably the most ostentatious of all of them, and that was built by his single daughter, Eugenie. She was a traveler, she traveled Europe. She would buy rooms from houses and castles and fine homes in Europe and brought them back and basically recreated them in her castle. Unfortunately, it was so big that when she died, no one was able to keep it up, and it was demolished and developed into a subdivision. But she does have a street called Eugenie named after her. In Willadell, there's a lot of remnants of the winemaking. There's a carved Bacchus in one of the mantles. There's a plaster frieze of all these cute little angels crushing grapes. There's not any artwork that shows any angels making soap. So winemaking was more important to the Work family. This is the home of Adele, the first home of Adele Work before they built the fabulous mansion that we already saw. This actually went up for sale last year, and we got to see all the pictures of the fabulously restored inside, and the wine cellar, of course, in the basement. His granddaughter Lillian Work Price built a nice home on Epworth, just around the corner from Hanky Winery. And his son Emil built a huge hunting lodge called Stonecroft on the lake that was named after him, Work Lake in Minnesota. So they all fared well with that money from winemaking. So one of the grapes that was the only grape that was proliferated here in Cincinnati, and one of the ones that was more hardy than the Catawba, was the Ives. And so from about the 1860s to the 1880s, there was the Ives Infatuation. And so grape growing moved from the west side of Cincinnati to the east side of Cincinnati. Henry Ives was a tailor who had moved here from Connecticut and lived in downtown Cincinnati. That's a picture on the left of his father. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of him. But he was a tailor in downtown Cincinnati, and there's an apocryphal story that he sort of was eating grapes while he was tailoring and spit them out the window, and like Jack and the Beanstalk arose this vine. Regardless of how it happened, he had created this new grape, and he brought them to one of the Cincinnati Horticultural Society meetings in 1844. Unfortunately, he had picked them too early, so they were still a little sour, and the majority of the people that tasted them said, this is not a good wine grape. However, one gentleman in Madeira, Colonel Isaac Waring, took some cuttings and started growing them and created a pretty prolific vineyard on the east side in Indian Hill. That's his house there that's still standing. And basically it spread throughout growers on the east side from Marymount, Plainville, Madeira, Indian Hill, and Madisonville. And that became the wine growing region of Cincinnati, specifically for the Ives, from about 1865 to about 1880. This is a map of Columbia Township, which shows Waring's house, and basically all the people surrounding him were also growers. That's the chapel in Indian Hill that most of those original Ives growers are buried at, their families. So it's no longer, the Ives is no longer being grown here in Cincinnati, but it is being grown up in Lake Erie, and Heinemann Winery, which is the oldest winery in Ohio, is still making sweet Ives wine from some of those original cuttings from Cincinnati's east side. So if you're interested in tasting a very legacy Cincinnati wine, you should visit Heinemann Winery. The other grape that's still being made here locally is the Norton Grape. And that came out of Virginia, a guy by the name of Dr. Daniel Norton. And Longworth knew about the Norton Grape. He actually grew it in some of his vineyards on a test basis, but you can see there, it's a significantly smaller berry than the Catalba. So he was looking for a grape that had as big, grape clusters as the Catalba, and he saw these small little berries of the Norton and said, it's not worth it. It's never gonna be as productive as the Catalba. Meanwhile, the people that grew Norton knew that it made a phenomenal red wine, which Longworth was never really able to find a red grape wine that he liked. And in fact, the cuttings of the Norton were sent to that German colony outside of St. Louis, Herman, Missouri. They're still making Norton wines from those original Cincinnati cuttings. And actually Norton is the state wine of Missouri. So they really took on to that Norton. There are 3 wineries here in Cincinnati that make a Norton wine. Hanky makes a Norton wine, Skeleton Root here in Over the Rhine, and then Mora Miranda, which is out in Ripley, Ohio, makes Norton wines. So in order to talk about Cincinnati wine, we also have to talk about altar wine. And the altar wine baron of Cincinnati, a guy by the name of Frank Stetter. And there's a connection to the Lloyd Library. So that's that gentleman in the center is Frank Stetter Jr. His father came to Cincinnati from Germany and started a wine business on the west side of downtown, kind of near the 6th Street Market. He befriends a guy by the name of Matthew Mangold and marries his sister. Frank unfortunately dies, but he and his wife had a child, Frank Stetter Jr., and Frank's widow and her brother continued this business, this wine business. Matthew Mangold marries the daughter of the editor of the Cincinnati, one of the Cincinnati Catholic papers, so they were able to advertise in that paper for their altar wine business. And that's Frank Stetter Jr. and an advertisement for their business. So one of the things about becoming a vendor for any archdiocese or any Catholic church is that you have to prove that it's pure wine, that it's not adulterated. And a lot of wine at the time was adulterated with brandy and sugar and all sorts of things. So in order to prove that their wines were fit for altar purposes, guess who they commissioned to test the chemistry of the wine to prove it was pure? John Uri Lloyd, the founder of the Lloyd Library. And so they used that testing, that chemical testing, to prove to archdioceses and archbishops that their wine was in fact pure and was able to be used at the altar. And so Frank Stetter basically served wine to 4 of the Cincinnati archbishops from Purcell, Moeller, Elder, and McNicholas, all who have high schools named after them. And I went to the Archdiocese archives to see what I could find out about the winemakers who supplied to the Archdiocese. And I found quite a few invoices from Fred Stetter during Archbishop Moeller's time. And each of those invoices also had a bottle of creme de menthe that apparently was Archbishop Moeller's favorite cocktail. He certainly wasn't using it to make grasshopper brownies. So that was kind of an interesting piece of information. So where are we with Cincinnati winemaking today? The only estate winery in Hamilton County is Vinicolet out in Coleraine Township. That crazy looking guy on the right is Kresko, the owner. He's a Croatian immigrant, interesting guy, funny guy. His shirt says, "Don't squeeze me before my time." And that sums it up for him. He was a former GE aircraft engineer and also an Olympic gymnast in his day. He's in his 80s and he's still an avid skier. In fact, he just got back from a skiing trip right before the new year. So still very active and crazy guy. And they have about 8 varietals that they grow in their vineyard, one of which is the Catawba, and they make some phenomenal wines. And actually, the sunset on the cover of my book is a view from their winery. So if you've never visited them, that's a really cool winery experience. There's Hanky Winery in Westwood. He makes wine in the basement of that his restaurant. They're celebrating their 25th year anniversary. Of course, there's Skeleton Root, which is a new urban winery in downtown Over the Rhine. And finally, Miranda Nixon in Ripley, Ohio. And they're also an estate winery. They grow the Norton Grape on site, and they're probably the most prolific maker of wine, of Norton wines in Southwest Ohio. So it looks like are we still good to continue with the Zoom? Yeah, okay. So I wanted to cross the river into Northern Kentucky and talk a little bit about the wine legacy over there. One of the very first wineries over in Kentucky is Latonia, Kentucky. And that was the winery of Corneau and Son. They were immigrants from the Loire Valley in France and came through Springfield, Illinois, and they heard about this Catawba craze happening in Cincinnati and moved to the Latonia area of Northern Kentucky in an area that was known as Banklick Creek. They started advertising their wine in 1851. This is a copy of one of their labels, Cornucopia Wines. I love a good pun, and apparently they had a good sense of humor. What was cool is that in 1850, they got a spread in the Cincinnati or the Horticultural Journal. So we have a very good lithographic image of the outside and the inside of their wine house over there in Latonia. And their wine press, which was shipped in from a winemaker in Paris. So one of the brothers, the Corneau brothers, stayed back in Springfield, Illinois, and became a pharmacist. His house, this is his restored house in Springfield. He was a next door neighbor of Abraham Lincoln. And he was his pharmacy, Charles Corneau, supplied a couple of products that were made by the winery here in Latonia. Catawba wine brandy, Catawba wine ipecac for medicinal purposes. And they're also the pharmacy that prescribed these blue mercury pills that supposedly mercury poisoned him and made him the moody guy that we know of. So kind of an interesting connection there. The Corneau family is still making wine in the original Loire Valley area where they immigrated from today. And you can buy their wine online. It's not very cheap. It's pretty expensive. So what's cool is the remnants of the Corneau wine house are still there and on a property. And those are some of the images. That property is the Monte Casino Bed and Breakfast. It's owned by Mark and Debbie Schmidt, who are our guests tonight. And what's cool about their property is that it also adjoins another long-term winery, the Monte Casino Winery, that was run by the Benedictines of the Archdiocese of Covington. And these are all the superiors who ran the operations of that winery from 1877 until 1925 when it closed. That's another group picture of the Benedictine monks that made wine. That's their wine house. that was built in the 1880s. That's an image of their vineyards. And then one of the coolest things from that property was this little chapel that they built right at the edge of the vineyards. And as they sold the property off, houses were built around it. And they decided, the owner of the property decided that we need to move this because it's just becoming kind of a hangout for teenagers. And so they picked up this little stone chapel that was built in the 1880s, and you can see how precariously they brought it out between two houses in its final resting place, which is on Thomas More College. So that is the last remnant of the Monte Casino vineyard, except for a couple of vineyard terraces that adjoin the bed and breakfast facility. So that's a little history of Cincinnati wine. Thanks for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Stop share.
Okay.
Any questions?
Yes.
I heard a story about the that it had been exported. Some of the clippings had gone to Europe and infected their vineyards with a parasite. Something at one time it was really in vogue to drink this bottle of wine, and then after that it became, something you didn't speak about.
Yeah, so that's an insidious part of our history. We sent a bunch of phylloxera mite infested cuttings over to Europe and nearly decimated the French and German vineyards. And we also saved them because we sent them more phylloxera resistant rootstock that they were able to replace all those with. But if we hadn't done that, there would probably not be a French or German wine industry because we had infected them in the very first place.
So the rootstock that you sent, is that from the United States? So the European.
Yeah, we infected them and saved them with our rootstock, basically. And there's a really good book about it. There's a monument over in France to the American winemakers of Cincinnati and Missouri that sent rootstocks that saved all those vines. Yes.
Cincinnati has such a strong beer making history. Was there competition between the beer makers and the winemakers, or was it more to kind of distinct customer base?
Oh, okay. For the Zoom guys, the question was asked, was there a competition between the beer industry and the wine industry? I would say there wasn't really competition. In fact, there were a lot of families that intermarried, wine families that intermarried with beer families. An example of that was, who was it? The Hauk family. Oh, so the Work, Casimir Work married a daughter of the Hauk brewing family. And Casimir was actually on the board of the Hauk brewery for a while. And they actually took that Golden Eagle brand of wine and brought it into the beer industry. And there was a Hauk's Golden Eagle lager. So they in that case, they shared the same brand. Yeah, I think the winemakers and the beer drinkers were different people. So people from Bavaria tended to be more beer drinkers because that's where the beer industry was in Germany. And people from, the Rhine region, Baden-Württemberg, tended to be wine drinkers because they were winemakers in that region. So I guess it depended on where in Germany you were from. And both of those immigrant groups came to Cincinnati, sure. Yes, sir.
Did any of the wineries employ slaves?
So there is record of one of the Ives growers, one of the early Ives growers in Madisonville, he did not employ slaves, but he employed free slaves. And there was one of the first freedmen's community over in Madisonville was formed by these people that were recruited to work for this vineyard in Madisonville. And I talk about that in the book. There were some, so Baker Bird Winery in Augusta, Kentucky, they had slave labor. There's no evidence that any of the Northern Kentucky breweries used any slave labor, but certainly as you went into Lexington, they used slave labor before the Civil War. All right. No other questions? All right.
Well, thank you so much, Dan.
Thanks.
If have to adjust this, there we go. If there are no questions from our Zoom audience, we will thank you for coming tonight. I'd like to let you know that programs such as these are supported by memberships to the Lloyd Library. If you're not a member, if you might want to consider joining the Lloyd Library. We also have a new exhibition that will be opening March 11th, which is On the Wing, an illustrated chapter on birds. And we're going to have a large series of programs on birds, both in person and in Zoom. So watch our website, watch social media for more details on that.